Our next speaker is Chryseis Modderman. She's an extension educator in crops and manure management based on the West Central Research and Outreach Center in Morris. Chryseis earned a bachelor's degree of soil science in agronomy from Southwest Minnesota State University and a master's degree in plant pathology from North Dakota State University. So Chryseis, take it away.
All right. Good morning. My name is Chryseis Modderman, Extension Educator, University of Minnesota. And welcome to the crappiest part of your day, because we are going to talk about manure. So how many of you here work with manure in some sort of way? Either you apply it, you work with clients that do, you have some sort of tangential connection to the manure world. Anyone? Oh, thank God. So I'm not irrelevant. I was ready to come here and be like, no one's going to want to hear about manure, right? Well, I'm glad that you all want to hear about manure. So I'm originally from West Central Minnesota. I grew up on a small farm there near the town of Benson. And like Fabian said, I went to SMSU for undergrad, NDSU for grad school, and then I hopped the border and came to Minnesota to work for Extension here. And today we are going to talk about two things. So we're going to have kind of a two-pronged approach to this. The first part, we're going to talk about some nitrogen common misunderstandings that I see with manure. Manure is a fantastic nutrient source. It's a fantastic fertilizer. It's got nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It's also got all the micronutrients that plants need to grow, maybe not in the right concentrations, but it's got them in there, plus organic matter. I'm a little biased since my whole job is manure nutrient management, but I think it's just an excellent nutrient source. Note about me, one more thing. I come at manure from a crop side. Don't ask me animal management, animal science questions. I don't have an animal science degree. I am a soil fertilizer manure gal. Okay, so along with manure being a good nutrient source, it does have some challenges, some drawbacks that make it a little bit of a different beast to deal with than commercial fertilizer. And I'm going to talk about two of those that I think are maybe the most misunderstood and the most applicable to nitrogen. And then after that, we're going to talk about some cover crop research with manure that might be of interest to you, since we're trying to look at nitrogen conservation in the soil with those. So I will do my best to stay on time because I do not want to rob the Sioux of any time. And we'll jump right into the first part here. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the perils of a nitrogen-based manure rate. And I think that's what most people do, are nitrogen-based rates. It's the highest rate you can apply. If you've got manure to get rid of, it's the highest rate that you can put on the field. But there are some perils that come with it. There's nothing wrong with it, but I'll show you what I mean. So I want to look at nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. So we got to talk about phosphorus a little bit. Fabian, don't come after me. I'm talking about phosphorus at a nitrogen conference. But with manure, I can't get away from it. We have all the nutrients in manure. I can't just talk about nitrogen. So we're going to talk about phosphorus a little bit. I'm sorry. But when we look at nitrogen to phosphorus ratios, what plants for the most part want is about 5 to 1, right? They want 5 parts nitrogen to 1 part phosphorus. Manure supplies not that, doesn't match up. So swine manure is about 4 to 1, beef about 2 to 1, dairy about 3 to 1, turkey about 2 to 1. Because with manure, our ratios are fixed, right? We can't really, unlike commercial fertilizer where we can kind of mix and match and adjust up and down, with manure, like my mom said, you get what you get and you don't make a fit, right? Your ratios are kind of set where they are. And so when we're applying manure at a nitrogen-based rate, what's happening to the phosphorus here? Is it being over-applied or under-applied? Over-applied, yeah, for the most part. Manure is notorious for over-applying phosphorus when applied at a nitrogen-based rate. So that's what I mean when I say the perils of a nitrogen-based rate. And why is over-application of phosphorus a problem? You build up your soil test phosphorus, and if you have high phosphorus in your soils, you have a responsibility to draw down your phosphorus over time, because high phosphorus soils lead to more phosphorus runoff. and loss into the environment, which can be a big problem for our surface waters. It's a leading cause of the harmful algal blooms and the excessive algae growth in lakes and surface water. And in Minnesota, do we have some surface water that we care about? A little bit. We have a couple lakes, a couple streams. Yeah. My neighbor's dog died last year because he drank out of a harmful algal bloom in a lake near Glenwood last year. I mean, it was a small dog. Not that I'm not saying that's less important than like a bigger dog, but still. So here's what I mean when I talk about nitrogen versus phosphorus-based rates. So if we look at that left graph first, I'll use the pointer on here for our online friends. So this graph here, this is kind of to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So the black line here is what the crop needs. It's what the crop wants. And then our yellow is what the manure supplies. And we have a little nitrogen credit in there too. So when we're filling this nitrogen bar all the way to the top and applying our manure at what the nitrogen needs and wants, look, we're like applying twice as much phosphorus as the plants need. And that ends up in our soil phosphorus buildup. We look over here on a phosphorus-based rate. So if you have high phosphorus soils, depending on your permitting to it, you might have to draw down. You might have to have a 6-year plan to draw down your soil phosphorus if it's very high. We have some land that hasn't had a shred of phosphorus on it in 25 years, and it's still high. Once you get high phosphorus soils, it is hard to draw down the phosphorus. I won't get into the phosphorus cycle or like any of the chemical reasons why that is, but once you have high phosphorus soils, it takes a lot of time to draw them down. So what you can do is you can apply your manure at a nitrogen-based rate every like 3 years or something. That's a luxury if you maybe don't have livestock and you're buying your manure. You can do that. I know some crop people that do that. Or you can apply at a phosphorus-based rate. So you look at the phosphorus needs of your crop and you fill the phosphorus bar to the top. That's what this right graph here is showing. We're filling that phosphorus to the top. But then you'll notice what's happening to nitrogen here. We're under applying nitrogen. This blue is additional fertilizer needed, and we need some additional potassium too. So some people don't like to hear, if I have manure, I should just be able to apply all my nutrients to it, right? But in that case, you're going to have to top up with a commercial fertilizer. If you've got high phosphorus soils, that's what you might need to do. Okay, so second thing I want to talk about is nitrogen availability. So we'll get back on the nitrogen track. I'll shut up about phosphorus for a little bit and we'll talk about nitrogen. So right, in a bag of urea, we know we've got 46% nitrogen. We know that is true all the time. Manure is not quite so simple to understand. And that's because, oh God, we got to look at the nitrogen cycle briefly. Don't panic. This is just the basic nitrogen cycle as it relates to manure. We're going to keep it simple. So looking at the soil, we've got 3 forms of nitrogen that we care about here. We've got organic nitrogen, ammonium nitrogen, and nitrate nitrogen. Which ones do manure supply? Yep, those first 2, organic nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen. Whoop, gave you the answer there. Which ones do plants use? Yeah, the next 2, right? So manure does not supply nitrate. If you test for nitrate in your manure, you're going to get like 0.08 or something very, very small. It does not directly supply nitrate. Does that mean manure doesn't need to care about nitrate? Do we get a free pass on nitrate? No, not at all. Because these transform in the soil, right? Organic nitrogen turn into ammonium nitrogen. That's why we have that 2nd-year credit. This stuff's not plant available. This stuff is. Organic will become ammonium over time, and ammonium will become nitrate over time. I'll add more of the arrows in just a moment. This is not the total nitrogen cycle, but just a brief aside, looking at the different nitrogen distribution between the organic form and the ammonium form. This says inorganic up there. That's synonymous with ammonium. Same thing in the manure world. So your animal types, liquid will generally have more of the immediately plant available that ammonium type than the organic type. And the opposite is true for the solid manures. Got more of the organic nitrogen in there. So look at the difference between these two images. That's not just poor graphic design by me. The size of the arrow on the left there is on purpose. So cattle manure provides more organic nitrogen than ammonium nitrogen. Swine manure is the opposite, more ammonium than organic. Sometimes with swine manure, we worry a little bit more about those fall applications, about that nitrification process, because if it's in the soil for a long time and you're starting out with a lot of ammonium, it's only got one jump to get to nitrate. Whereas cattle manure, for the most part, has more that needs to make 2 jumps. There's the full nitrogen cycle. That's that transformation I talked about, organic nitrogen to ammonium, that mineralization process. There's a year 3 on here. There is some evidence that we got a little bit of a year 3, but we don't take a credit for that right now. There are some states that do, we do not. And then that nitrification process to get to nitrate. The red arrows here are loss pathways. You'll notice that nitrate is a leaky son of a gun. It has our most loss pathways of any nitrate form or nitrogen form that we've got. So what does this mean when we're trying to figure out application for manure? This is our magic table that we use at all opportunities in the manure world for calculating application rate. And it is % of total nitrogen available per year. And its big 2 factors are animal type and application method. So animal type is down the left here, and you've got year 1 availability and year 2 availability. And then we've got application methods across the top. We want you to incorporate within 12 hours. That would be best to avoid volatilization losses to the atmosphere. Injection is considered immediate incorporation, obviously. Yeah, animal species and application method is what impacts that. So a common error that I see, probably the most common error that I see when calculating manure application rates, is using the wrong nitrogen value, using the wrong number to calculate your application rate. And we're talking about a nitrogen-based rate here again. So use plant available nitrogen, not total nitrogen. I just showed you this a minute ago, because remember, that's not plant available, that is. So if and total nitrogen measures both of these when you're testing your manure. So if you're applying and calculating based on your total nitrogen number, you are often under applying nitrogen, because just the ammonium is going to be plant available that first year. So here's how you do that. We'll go through this quickly. So your total nitrogen that you got from your manure test that you definitely did, please test your manure. The book values that we have are not, they're just averages. Take manure tests, get it tested, find out what's actually in your manure. So we look at total nitrogen, and then we multiply by the availability factor. So that 34.3 that we got on that last from the manure test times our availability factor that we find from this magic table that we use constantly. So we're looking at a dairy manure here. It was sweep injected, so we're using 55% as our nitrogen availability factor. Gives us our plant available nitrogen. So 18, about 19 pounds per 1,000 gallons is what we should be using to calculate our application rate, not 34. So here's an example of this happening. This was sent to me, producer of corn. This is a continuous corn rotation. It's not a rotation continuous corn, but that's an aside. Who it has no livestock. This is a guy that buys turkey manure from a neighbor, doesn't own any livestock, doesn't really know the manure world at all. So we had a custom applicator apply this for him. You can see we're doing 3 tons per acre. So this is turkey manure. You can tell that by the 3 tons per acre. That's a very low application rate. And this is all the records he gets, by the way. Transferred manure is like the black box of the manure world. When you sell it to someone else, they're supposed to keep records for 6 years. And I was like, do you have 6 years worth of this information? He's like, it's somewhere. You know, this is his records. This is what he gets. And this analysis over here, this is just written up NPK. That doesn't tell me if that's total nitrogen, if that's ammonium nitrogen. That doesn't tell me if they did the elemental phosphorus or P2O5. This is not very helpful. So we dug down and got the actual analysis, and that is total nitrogen. Can you see what was done wrong here? Their application rate is 3 tons per acre. They just took 64.5 times 3 to get their application rate. So whether the custom applicator, whether the turkey producer knew this or not, the crop farmer did not. He's like, I just got 193.5 pounds of nitrogen per acre applied to my continuous corn. That's good. I got 193. That's great, but he doesn't. So if we look at that availability factor again, they incorporate within 12 hours. So we're using 70% available for turkey. That's 64.5 times 70%. 45.2 is really what it's using. So what was actually applied is 135, which is quite a bit less than what that farmer thought he got. Okay, we're gonna switch over and talk about some cover crop results. I'm gonna check my time. I'm doing good. So cover crops with manure are a challenge, right? We want to get our cover crops on early. We know biomass production is super important in Minnesota. And also doing this research in Minnesota is important. You can look at Iowa data, you can look at Wisconsin data, you can look at similar research that's been done in other parts of the state. But maybe I would take North Dakota data, but they tend to have more growing degree days than us, especially if you're looking at southern Wisconsin. So especially with cover crops, and we're trying to get them established in the fall, we need research here in Minnesota. So this is what we did. We looked at 4 sites around the state, looked at a few different crop rotations and injecting manure into standing cover crop, right? Because with cover crop, you want to get it established early. And then if you're trying to use manure with it, you got to get it incorporated without tearing up your cover crop. So that's what we're trying to figure out to do here. So we got sweet corn and corn, soybean corn, and continuous silage corn. I'm not going to talk about the on-farm strip till. I don't have data for that today, but that was also kind of done in conjunction with this, where manure was injected to like strip till. That was their strip till out there, was the manure injection and then planted directly into that. Super interesting. I'm sorry that I'm showing it to you here and then I don't have data for it. Okay, so the application method was a sweep type system, and we decided to use this based on previous research that had been done on application type. The equipment used is super important to try to get the minimum disturbance on the surface. You can still see we had a little bit of clotting. Soil type matters so much when you're looking at minimum disturbance equipment in the manure world. Soil type, moisture can really impact that. This is from that previous research that I talked about, where they used that same equipment. 2 weeks after injection, doesn't look too bad. Following spring, couldn't even tell it was there. So that's what we were using, what we were going with. Okay, silage corn. We were looking at cover crop seeding timing. So we want to get it on early, right? So what if we interseeded it with a standing crop, right? Put it in with the corn while the corn is growing, and then drilled after harvest, and there was a treatment with no cover crop at all. And then we looked at nutrient source timing too. So we looked at early manure, so before the soils were 50 degrees. 50 degrees is that threshold where it slows down the nitrification process. Because there's the theory that, you apply nitrogen with your early manure and it can help tie up that nitrogen and hold it there, and maybe you won't lose as much to nitrification. We did late manure after the 50 degrees, and then a spring fertilizer treatment that was just to kind of compare it to, it was applied in the spring after we had taken biomass samples. So with trials like this, I use these little arrows to tell you that every treatment was done with every other treatment. So for like the interseeded, we had an interseeded early manure, interseeded late manure. Each of them were tested with each other. We're not just testing blocks of these. They're all randomized within each other. Okay, so here's some results. Our biomass, looking at fall versus spring. This is 2 years of data laid on top of each other because they were kind of the same trends both years, 2020 and 2021, I believe. Interseeded at V4, so when the corn's about knee high, pretty young. Overseed is people always, after this presentation, someone's going to ask me what the difference between interseed and overseed is, and they're kind of the same thing. It's just we're doing it later, so R5, so when the corn is tall, and then you can see the drilled after harvest. And the black bars are the fertilizer. So note that the fertilizer ones were not disturbed by injecting the manure. They were left alone. You can see that we've got in the fall here, our highest biomass were the ones that weren't disturbed. Maybe not super surprising there. And then our early and late manure didn't seem to matter all that much. Our biomass didn't really catch up. We have more biomass in the fall than in the spring. Here we were using annual ryegrass mixed with winter rye, and that I think the annual ryegrass kind of outcompeted the winter rye in the fall, and then it kind of died, it died back in the winter, so there wasn't as much left over in the spring. And then when we look at yield for that, manure is great, right? Our early or late manure increased our silage yield compared to just the fertilizer alone. And maybe a reason for that, we think, is corn-on-corn systems are tough on the soil, right? They're a high nutrient input need system. So manure with all its micronutrients may have helped a little bit more there than just the fertilizer. And then looking at the cover crop over here, the interseeded early had about the same yield as no cover crop at all. And then as we delayed planting a little bit, our yield did go down. A note on the letters up here, if it's got the same letter, it is not different statistically, we say. If it has a different letter, it is different. Okay, sweet corn. Here we drilled all of these after harvest and we just looked at different types of cover crops. Here we've got winter rye, oat that winter kills. We wanted something that would winter kill, and then a mix. And then once again, no cover crop. Once again, early manure, late manure, spring fertilizer. And here's what we found for biomass. You'll see on the right graph there that our 2020 and 2021 data is separated out because we saw vastly different things. And it's a good time to remind you that the environment is such a fickle mistress. And everything we do, it seems, is either thwarted or helped by the environment. And so some years we're like, yeah, hey, this was great. Other years, not so much. And sometimes you can get directly conflicting results just based on your environment and what kind of year it was. Looking at fall biomass, we got really good growth with that early manure. Especially in 2019, we had a nice long, warm fall. The 2019 fall would line up with that 2020 spring then, of course. And so we actually got, pretty good biomass there. And then when we looked at the spring following that, in 2020, we saw that our late manure was one of our best performers here for biomass. And in 2021, we kind of saw the opposite, where early manure really took off, but late manure, not so much. There's nothing for oat because it winter killed. Should note that. Some things that were interesting with this trial that we did, where we had high level, we had a lot of rye growth, and planting into that may have been hindered by the amount of residue that we ended up with. On the left here is the winter rye with early applied manure. So you can see how much trash is left on the surface there. And this is conventional till. This was mixed pretty well. And then you can see on the right there was where the oats were that winter killed. So there's no real residue there, or not a lot anyway. And those, I don't know if you can see the corn that's supposed to be growing there, but these were planted on the same day. These are quite a bit bigger than these. And whether that was a planting issue, trying to plant down through that trash and not getting good seed to soil contact, or maybe with all that organic material and carbon that comes with that residue, maybe we had some nitrogen tie up with that, maybe a little of both things. We do have soil tests from that. I don't have the data for that, but soil tests were taken with that. And then also we saw some nutrient deficiencies out there. You can kind of see on the left here, maybe you can't see that very well, but the stand is a little wavy. It's shorter here, taller here, shorter here. And then with our early manure, you can really see the nutrient or the nitrogen deficiencies, that yellowing of the corn, of those lower leaves, because remember, nitrogen is very mobile in the plant and it'll take it up into the higher leaves that need it. And so it'll leave these lower ones kind of yellow compared to these were taken on the same day. The fertilizer plots weren't showing those same sorts of deficiencies. And we saw those with the early manure, which kind of was a sign that we were going to see a little bit of this. So looking at grain yield, our early manure took a yield hit, and we think it's because of those nitrogen deficiencies, which means the cover crop didn't do what we were hoping it would do and hold that nitrogen where we put it. Because with that early manure, we still ended up losing that nitrogen to the environment, even though we got really good rye biomass. It didn't help all that much. I mean, it didn't take a giant yield hit, but still. And then anywhere we had rye, we had lower grain yield as well. Now, whether we got that decreased yield because of nitrogen loss due to nitrification, or if it was tied up by that extra residue in some of those plots, is up for debate. The jury's still out on that. And anywhere we had rye in the mix, or in the rye stand, we had a yield hit as well, for probably some of those reasons that I showed you in those pictures. All right, last one here is soybean. We're doing good. Interseeded, once again, we're doing timing again, and then we're looking at nutrient source timing as well, but we can never get an early manure application on there. The soybeans came off so late that the soil was already cold enough where it would be considered a late manure application, where the soils are 50 degrees or cooler. So there's a pretty simple story for this trial. It was a good a good example of getting your cover crop established early helps with biomass and how important that is. Because our overseeded was planted earlier in the season and then drilled was after harvest. And our biomass is way down for anything that was drilled. Oh, and then we did some soil Urundies projects. I'm sure you've seen those. You buy a bunch of cotton underwear and try to justify that to your accountant that it's definitely for research purposes and science, absolutely. And then you bury them in the soil and you come back and see how much of that cotton material was eaten by the soil microbes. So less underwear remaining means you have better soil microbial activity. And so we did these in a few different fields, and the field to field differences weren't in between treatments, didn't make that much of a difference, but crop rotation actually made that much of a difference. So corn on corn on corn didn't have as much microbial activity in the soil as soybean corn. So even having a little bit of rotation in there improved our soil microbial activity. This is not a quantitative way to measure your soil microbial activity. It's just a fun visual that is, it's a very visual way to see it. You know, we're not looking at graphs or numbers. We're looking at amount of manure left. or manure, underwear left. So yield for the corn following the soybean, we saw no significant differences between the fertilizer and the manure or based on cover crop timing. Once again, we think maybe our soils are maybe a little more resilient and have a little more, our manure didn't help as much on a corn soybean rotation as it did on a continuous corn that's more depleting to the soil. Things we've learned so far: get cover crop planted early. Low disturbance injection is key to getting those cover crops established and standing. And then manure, early manure still risks nutrient loss for nitrogen, even with cover crops. That's what I've got. The question is, where we saw yield hit with the rye and such, could it be some sort of green bridge to a pathogen? Possibly. We didn't look at that. None of our leaves looked diseased out there. We didn't dig up any roots to look for soil-borne pathogens, though. But our plants looked healthy for the most part, except for those nitrogen deficiency symptoms.
Good. The next question is, it seems that a lab analysis result for organic and ammonia nitrogen is much more accurate than assumptions based on livestock species. Why not use it? So
the question is, getting an ammonium test from a soil testing or a manure testing lab is better than just using that magic table. And it is, absolutely. Manure testing labs have kind of their basic vanilla package is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. If you just pay for their basic thing, you're gonna get total nitrogen. You have to ask or make sure you mark the right box or whatever to get the ammonium test. Whenever I test manure, I always test for ammonium. It is more accurate than that table. But that table is better than nothing for the vast, large amount of people that don't pay the extra for the ammonium test.
Any look at using covers to help with nutrient retention for those doing winter or early spring applications?
Using cover crops for nutrient retention for winter or early spring applications. Winter application isn't, your plant's not going to take up anything, even if you've got kind of dormant cover crops going on. Winter is not a great time to apply manure. I know it is a necessary evil for some operations. Daily scrape and haul operations are still out there. They still happen. Spring application, maybe a little bit. It depends on when your crop starts growing. Your crop's not going to start taking up nutrients and doing what it's going to do until your soils are, 50 degrees anyway.
Good. Wouldn't some of the rye effects include allelopathic effects from the rye?
Allelopathic effects from the rye. Maybe. It's hard to tell. We did, in the studies where we didn't have very high rye biomass, we didn't see those reductions in yield that you sometimes see with rye. Rye kind of gets a bad rap sometimes for reducing yield in your following crop. So I think since we didn't see it with the silage, the continuous silage corn trial, I think it's more likely that it was our extra plant matter, extra carbon that we had going on, and maybe some planter issues trying to plant into all that residue.
Has there been much research on harvesting the rye in the spring and then plant corn silage? See a few guys doing it, but haven't seen much data.
So harvesting the rye in the spring and then planting corn. Yeah, you see it sometimes. We haven't done research on it. We had quite enough factors going on in that last trial. We haven't done research, but I hear good things from people that do it, but I don't have any data to support that or refute that.
Will composted manure have more or less nitrogen available? Assuming manure tests from bottom, top, and middle of the pile will be appropriate?
Composted manure, I could talk all day about composted manure. I love talking about composted manure. More or less nitrogen, it's going to have more of the organic form of nitrogen. You're going to lose a lot of that ammonium nitrogen through the process of composting. When you're turning the pile, you're losing that nitrogen. And so what you're left with is that organic nitrogen form for the most part, if you're properly composting. And so that's going to be that slow release nitrogen in the soil. And I will just mention also that aged manure is not composted manure. People tell me all the time, I compost manure, and they've got a pile that's been sitting there for 5 years with weeds growing out of it. Composting manure takes active management, temping, those sorts of things.
Wouldn't the farmer have had 135 pounds of nitrogen applied since it was 3 tons per acre, and the analysis was on a part per ton basis? The 193 pounds of total N times the 70%.
Yes, he had 135 pounds of nitrogen applied. He thought he had 195. So what he thought he had and what he actually had were not the same, and that could be a concern when he thought he had more than what he had.
How effective is a urease inhibitor for surface applied liquid manure and for no-till scenarios?
Urease inhibitors and manure is not something I know things about. It's not research we've done. I'm barely catching up to the nitrification inhibitor questions that we get. We have not done anything with urease inhibitors.
How does winter affect the application of manure?
Winter application of manure, don't do it if you can. if you can avoid it, if you have the storage to make it to spring, don't do it. What is it? Discovery Farms has that stat that almost 50% of all the runoff that happens in a year happens in 2 months, February, March. Maybe not this year. We're having a weird winter. But anything you apply on top of snow is going to melt, it's going to run off, it's going to be lost. And not only are you an environmental hazard, you are losing those valuable nutrients that you put there and are very valuable. Understand it's a necessary evil for some still, don't recommend it.
I was just thinking about the previous question too, and I was thinking of Alan's presentation on using the right inhibitor for the right thing. And with manure, if you're leaving the manure on the soil surface, that's already a problem. It would be way better to incorporate that manure into the soil, and at that point, you don't really need to worry about volatilization losses. Anyway, efficacy and economics for adding humic substances.
Adding humic substances, I know nothing about this, I'm sorry.
Okay. And is the yield drop in the early applied manure due to the cover crop taking up N, or is it converted to nitrate too early and lost to the environment?
So yield drop for the applied manure, early applied manure, is it because the cover crop took up the N, or it was converted to nitrate and lost? I suppose we don't know. The hope with cover crops is that if it's taken up by the cover crop, it's still there, that we can get it back. Can we? Maybe, maybe not. I think maybe a more daunting question is if a residue was our problem there, or if it was lost from nitrification.
All right, well, very good.
Thanks for all the questions.
Yeah, great questions. Let's give Chryseis a hand. Thank you.